Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who really doesn't need any introduction. We are incredibly grateful to our sponsor, BD, who is supporting Dr. Fauci's lecture today. And so here to welcome Dr. Fauci to the AAAS Annual Meeting virtual stage is BD's Chief Executive Officer, Tom Polen. Tom?
Hello, I'm Tom Polen, CEO and President of BD, one of the largest medical technology companies in the world, and one that's dedicated to advancing the world of health by improving medical discovery, diagnostics, and the delivery of care. We're extremely proud to sponsor today's plenary and fireside chat with Dr. Fauci. I can't think of anyone more qualified to speak about the intersection of science and society. It's fitting that the theme of this year's conference is Understanding Dynamic Ecosystems. As our more than 70,000 associates around the world could tell you, I often say that healthcare is the most dynamic industry there is. And over the past year, there's never been a more dynamic or rewarding time to work in this industry. BD and others in the med tech and pharmaceutical industries have marshaled our scientific, engineering, and manufacturing capabilities to quickly develop evidence-based and data-driven solutions to support governments and healthcare providers as they tackle the largest healthcare crisis in generations. Whether it's driving cutting-edge research to understand COVID-19, how it works, how we can test for it, and ultimately find a cure, or it's developing rapid point-of-care antigen tests and molecular diagnostic tests, or scaling up production to supply millions of products globally used in the fight against COVID-19, from swabs to infusion pumps to injection devices for vaccine delivery. It's the cutting-edge research and development that takes place in the healthcare industry. It's literally a matter of life and death. And that's a humbling thought, I think, for all of us. It's why science and a keen sense of purpose drive our decisions and our solutions way beyond the business case. I'm proud of our role in the COVID-19 response around the world. But there's no single company that can even come close to solving this challenge alone. It's got to be a highly coordinated partnership between medical technology companies, pharma, healthcare providers, governments, healthcare agencies, foundations, and distribution channels to make this work, with all parties studying the science and the data with no agenda beyond protecting society from this devastating virus. And then we must use this experience and learn from it to inform our response to halt future outbreaks before they can exact such a devastating toll. There's a common saying, knowledge is power, and science is the basis of our knowledge. So here's Dr. Fauci, one of the most esteemed leaders in the battle against COVID-19.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you today to talk about COVID-19 in 2021. I've entitled my talk, Lessons Learned and Remaining Challenges. As you see, there are certainly a lot of things that we've learned over this extraordinary more than a year that we've been faced with this challenge. But as you'll see in a moment, we still have a number of challenges remaining. So I'm going to divide the talk into 7 components. And due to the restraints on time, I'm going to be able to only talk about some of the highlights in each of these 7 components. The first being the epidemiology, and most extraordinary unfolding of a previously unknown disease. In the very first week and a half of January, following the recognition of unusual cases of pneumonia in the Wuhan district of central China, the Chinese put on a public database the sequence of a virus which turned out to be a novel coronavirus that had never before been seen in the human species. From that week in January 2020 to today, literally as of yesterday, we now have experienced over the last more than a year now, a little bit more than a year, the most extraordinary pandemic of a respiratory disease in the last 102 years since the infamous pandemic of 1918, with, as I mentioned, as of yesterday, 106 million recorded cases of disease, with over 2.3 million deaths worldwide. The United States of America, a rich and highly developed country, was hit harder than any other country on earth, with almost 27 million cases. And again, as of yesterday, over 460,000 deaths. If you look at the patterns of the surges of infection, it's really interesting. We had an early surge in the late winter, early spring of 2020, which was dominated predominantly by the explosion of cases in the Northeastern corridor, particularly the New York metropolitan area. Of note, when that surge ended, we never got down to a good baseline where we were having somewhere around 20,000 infections a day. When we tried to open up the economy, as it were, some of you may remember, we had first 15 and then 30 days of a measured opening up of the country, which unfortunately was not uniformly followed in a consistent way by the various cities and states throughout the country, leading to a second surge in the early summer. But of note, as the cold weather set in for most of the country in the late fall and early winter, as well as the holiday seasons of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, we had a major surge with an inflection curve that was much more acute than the previous ones. As we see now, as we get into the beginning of February and the end of January, the cases have plateaued and have come down, but we experienced an extraordinary situation of where we had up to 400,000 new cases a day and up to 4,000 deaths per day, with the situation almost, but not quite, overrunning hospitals in certain sections of our country. If you look at the average daily deaths in the United States, COVID-19 in early 2021 is the leading cause of death in the United States, surpassing heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and other commonly recognizing high causes of death in the United States. Of note that when you compare the number of deaths thus far, and we're not through yet with this challenge, it has exceeded the number of US deaths in World War II, as shown here on the slide, comparing various causes of deaths through wars and major pandemics. An interesting and unfortunate aspect of this outbreak is the profound racial and ethnic disparities, not only with incidence of infection, but with severe outcomes such as hospitalizations and deaths, particularly among brown and Black people. If you look at the number of hospitalization per 100,000 population, and you compare our minority population, shown in the bars on the top of the slide, with Native Americans, Hispanics, and Blacks compared to whites, the disparity is obvious and profound, as is the deaths per 100,000 by race or ethnicity. Looking at the top of the slide with African Americans at 139 compared to whites at 89. A quick look and snapshot at the virology. In January of 2020, I wrote this viewpoint for JAMA, and I entitled it Coronavirus Infections More Than Just the Common Cold. I was not at all meaning to be facetious, but I wanted to point out to the reviewers of the viewpoint, the readers of the viewpoint, that we have had experience with coronavirus for decades and decades. In fact, when you look at the phylogenetic tree with the human coronaviruses in red font, 4 of these are accounting for anywhere from 15 to 30% of the common colds that we recurrently experience, usually during the winter months. In 2000, what is going on? In 2002, we had the SARS coronavirus 1, and in 2012, we had the MERS coronavirus, and then where we are right now with 2020-21, we have SARS-CoV-2. The virology, very quickly, it's a beta coronavirus, an RNA virus, which, as you might expect, would ultimately lead to a number of mutations leading to variants, which I'll get into in a moment. 4 structural proteins, the most important of which is the S protein, accounting for the spike, which is the target and the immunogen for essentially all the vaccines in current use. Back in 2002 with SARS-CoV-1, it was recognized that the cellular receptor was the ACE2 receptor present in the upper and lower airway, GI tract, and even most recently seen on cardiovascular tissue. I mentioned a moment ago the inevitability of the emergence of mutants leading to new lineages. We are being challenged with this now as mutants such as those in the United Kingdom, which is now dominating in the UK and is seen in the United States in over 33 states, as well as the more problematic South African mutant, which is the 351, which has been shown to have a moderate to severe effect on the efficacy of several vaccines, and certainly against monoclonal antibodies. We'll get back to that in a moment when we talk about vaccines. The transmission of this respiratory virus is, as you would expect, mainly through exposure to respiratory droplets, as well as some indication that in addition to the classic size droplets, which tend to drop within 6 to 8 feet, that there is a degree of transmission in aerosol or smaller droplets, which remain suspended for a period of time and distances. The virus is found in different bodily fluids, but the role in transmission is unknown and likely not of particular significance compared to the respiratory route. Some interesting observations about this virus that really makes it different than virtually any other respiratory virus that we've encountered. The available data suggests that at least 1/3, and sometimes in other studies, up to 40 to 45% of people who get infected never develop symptoms. And superposed upon that is that if you look at the transmission of virus, over 50% of all infections are resulting from transmission from someone who had no symptoms. 35% from an individual when they were in the pre-symptomatic phase and ultimately developed symptoms, and 24% from individuals who never developed symptoms. This has made it extremely problematic to do the classic type of identification, isolation, and contact tracing, as well as the testing strategy when we first began testing only individuals who had clear symptoms. The fundamentals to preventing acquisition and transmission are shown here, with universal wearing of masks, maintaining physical distance, avoiding crowds and congregate settings, particularly indoors, attempting to the extent possible to conduct activities outdoors rather than indoors, and to engage in frequent washing of hands. Diagnosis, very quickly, 3 major components: molecular PCR test for a highly sensitive, specific diagnostic to determine if a particular individual is infected. Now, much more emphasis being put on rapid point of care antigen tests, which do not have the degree of sensitivity of the PCR, but when done repetitively can give you a good indication in a surveillance way of the extent of infection in whatever community, school, factory, or what have you, you're trying to determine. And then obviously antibody test to determine prior exposure and infection. As I mentioned, much emphasis on antigen tests, with new tests now being available in the pharmacy, such as this eLoom COVID-19 home test, which the federal government is making major investments to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to contract to make millions and millions of tests, as many as 19 million per month. Remember, these are rapid, relatively sensitive and specific, performing yourself at home, not requiring a prescription, which we believe is going to be the way to go in the future to do surveillance that would allow people to return some more to a normal type of existence. Clinical course, as I mentioned, up to 40% of people have no symptoms, but those that do, about 80% have mild to moderate symptoms. And those who have symptoms, about 20% or more have severe or critical requiring hospitalization. The case fatality rate varies from around 2 to 3% for people who are hospitalized to up to 20% for those requiring mechanical ventilation and high flow oxygen. The manifestations of severe COVID-19 are protean, the most common of which is the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. But as we've gained more experience clinically, it has become clear that other organ systems clearly can be involved, such as the cardiovascular system, neurological, acute kidney injury, and then very interesting pathogenic factors such as hypercoagulability, and first in children, but now seeing in adults, a multi-system inflammatory syndrome, very reminiscent of Kawasaki disease. When you look at advanced disease, it is very clear of the discrepancy between mild to moderate disease versus severe disease, and the relationship between the presence of viral load and the level of inflammatory cytokines and aberrant inflammatory and immunological responses, which really are very few when you look at mild to moderate disease. But for those with severe disease, the level of aberrant inflammation dominates the clinical picture, leading to therapeutic interventions, as I'll get to shortly, such as dexamethasone, which have proved quite effective in diminishing the mortality of individuals who go on to advanced disease. In addition, there's autoimmunity against certain components like interferon, where rogue autoantibodies, as was described in Nature, could actually be part of the pathophysiological process of the aberrant inflammatory response associated with this disease. If one looks at the people who are at increased risk for severe disease, clearly older adults dominate that. Because if you look at the hospitalization per 100,000 population, the extraordinary discrepancy of age, with elderly individuals 75 years of age or older compared to individuals shown on the left-hand part of the slide, younger individuals, the discrepancy in hospitalization is profound. Others at increased risk for severe illness are people of any age with certain underlying medical conditions, such as shown on this slide. Those that are clearly stand out as important are obesity, particularly morbid obesity with a BMI of greater than 30, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, immunocompromised states, as seen with individuals who have received solid organ transplantation. Other medical conditions that may be conferring an increased risk are shown on this slide. Again, I point out to you overweight, diabetes, hypertension, and a variety of immunocompromised states. There's an additional syndrome called post-acute COVID syndrome, or PACS, PACS, which is a certain proportion of individuals, and we're doing right now cohort studies to examine the prevalence and the duration of a syndrome in which individuals following the clearance of virus have lingering symptoms, including what some are referring to as brain fog, or an inability to focus or concentrate. In a recent study from China, in a cohort of over 1,700 patients, the 6-month follow-up showed a significant proportion of people with fatigue and weakness, sleep difficulties, anxiety, or depression. We had a workshop on this syndrome at the NIH on December the 3rd and the 4th, and right now a considerable amount of resources will be put into determining the extent, the prevalence, and hopefully understanding the pathogenesis of this very confounding syndrome. Regarding therapeutics, there have been a number of clinical trials, some of which have been randomized placebo-controlled trials, which have led to both the approval of and the emergency use authorization of interventions such as remdesivir, which is a direct antiviral agent, monoclonal antibodies, predominantly from Lilly and Regeneron, convalescent plasma, and a number of other interventions are still undergoing clinical trials, such as hyperimmune globulin, anticoagulants, and immunomodulators. When you're looking at therapeutics for moderate or advanced disease, as I alluded to a moment ago, the most dramatic results have come from the use of a very commonly used intervention, dexamethasone, in hospitalized individuals, particularly those on ventilators and requiring high flow oxygen, with a significant diminution in the 28-day mortality. The NIH has helped to develop what's called a guidelines panel made up of individuals throughout the country and the world with good clinical experience in COVID-19, who have developed a living document that's online and updated very frequently, giving clinicians throughout the country and the world the opportunity to have access to the most updated recommendations for the clinical care of individuals with COVID-19. And finally, the major success story thus far has been in the arena of vaccines. In fact, Science Magazine in their December 17th issue has voted the COVID-19 vaccine as the 2020 breakthrough of the year. And this is really a reflection of the application of the extraordinary science of vaccine platform technology, as well as understanding the importance of the conformation of immunogens such as the pre-fusion spike protein. The US has made major investments in the development of and/or clinical trials of 3 separate platforms with a number of companies involved, both the mRNA, chimp ad, as well as human ad, as well as recombinant proteins together with adjuvants. As shown on the right-hand part of the slide, 2 of these thus far have been granted emergency use authorization, the Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech candidates showing a 94 to 95% efficacy in symptomatic disease. Soon we will be hearing about the results from the J&J trial, the Janssen, which is now having their data being examined by the FDA, and other candidates that you've heard of, including AstraZeneca, as well as Novavax. The idea of having a situation where you've gone from determining the sequence of the virus on January 10th to 65 days later being in a phase 1 trial, to July 27th beginning the phase 3 trial, to having vaccine with proven efficacy of 94 to 95% going into the arms of individuals by December of that same year is totally unprecedented and never would have at all been predicted a decade ago that you would have been able to do this in such a truncated period of time, which is really a reflection of the extraordinary science that went into this well into 10 years prior to this, as well as the application of knowledge gained from structure-based vaccine design that started in earnest with HIV, but was applicable in a very positive way to study of the vaccines for SARS-CoV-2. The very impressive Kaplan-Meier plot shown for both the Moderna and the Pfizer BioNTech are shown here leading to the 94 to 95% efficacy that I mentioned a moment ago. And these are the New England Journal of Medicine papers reporting, in this case, the Pfizer candidate, and in this case, the Moderna candidate. Also, as you probably heard of over the last couple of weeks, data is now coming out from Novavax in a UK study that showed about 90% effective against symptomatic disease, including the 117 variant, which is now dominating in the UK, a diminished efficacy against symptomatic disease in the South Africa 351 variant, again, not unexpected, as this has veered away from the wild type virus that had first come out of China into the rest of the world. As I mentioned, J&J, which is a single shot vaccine, has shown in a study simultaneously done in the United States, Brazil, and South Africa to be 72% effective in the United States, only 57% effective in South Africa. But one of the important things to point out is that when you're looking at severe disease, it was about 88% effective in preventing severe disease. And when you talk about deaths and hospitalizations, it did very, very well with essentially no deaths or hospitalizations among the vaccinated people. So even though the 72% is not as good as a 94 to 95% in mild to moderate disease, it does protect reasonably well, if not very well, against severe disease. The United States by no means is not the only country at all that's been successful with vaccines. The Russians just recently published in Lancet their efficacy studies of their trial with 91 to 92% efficacy against symptomatic disease. The Chinese and the Indians also have candidates which look promising. So the vaccine endeavor, from the standpoint not only of the United States, but globally, has been a very positive story. Let me just finish about vaccine distribution. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which advises the CDC, has put out a distribution strategy, different phases with healthcare personnel and long-term care facility residents receiving first priority, followed by people older than 60, 75, and essential workers, including teachers. A phase 1C, 65 to 74, and people who are younger but have high-risk conditions. And then finally, the phase 2 with essentially everyone else. We're hoping as we get more vaccine, as we go into the end of February, March, April, and into May, that we will be able soon to get vaccines available to anyone who wants them, to be able to get the population of this country, at least the United States, up to 85% of people vaccinated before we get to the middle and end of the summer. A very quick word about efficacy versus effectiveness. As I mentioned, we have a 94 to 95% efficacious vaccine. The effectiveness is going to depend on the uptake, which gets us to the point of why it's important that there, as shown in this slide, still considerable concern about various aspects of the vaccine, which is the reason why we're putting a considerable effort in outreaching to the public, particularly the minority population, of why it's important for their own safety, that of their families and their community, to get vaccinated when it becomes available. We're doing better and better. We're now up to about 1.5 million doses per day, hopefully going to get well over 2 million doses a day as we go on. The public appeal to the U.S. general public to get vaccinated is done by any of a number of mechanisms of outreach. One of the most effective was showing the confidence in the safety and efficacy of the vaccine by our leaders. In this case, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris receiving their doses in a public fashion, as has Francis Collins and I, and on the right-hand side of the slide, former Secretary Alex Azar receiving our doses at the NIH in December. And all three of us have also received our booster dose. So it really was trying to make the American public realize the confidence in the safety and the efficacy. A word on herd immunity. We don't know exactly what percentage of the population would need to be vaccinated for develop herd immunity. The estimate is somewhere between 70 and 85%, but that's going to be challenging in the context of what I mentioned a moment ago, of vaccine hesitancy, new variants, and the possibility of waning immunity. I want to close with this last slide. It's very clear that in addition to addressing the challenge we're facing now with this current coronavirus, that we need to look ahead, because this will have been the third pandemic coronavirus that we will have faced. So it's clearly the time to start now to develop a universal coronavirus vaccine, which is already in the works as we look forward to what we might be facing in the years to come. I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions.
Can you hear me, Dr. Fauci?
I can, John.
Thanks so much for doing that. And that was a wonderful talk. And I am here with my 91-year-old mother, Esther. I came to LA today to help her get her second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And I thought we could open with her asking you a question, because she has a burning question for you.
Oh,
Take it away, Mom.
It's really burning, Dr. Fauci. I love you. I play mahjong like all the Jewish yentas with 4 other women. Now that we've all had our second shot, can we play? We play on a bridge table, close to each other for 4 hours. Do I have to wear a mask, or I can't play?
You know, that's a really good question. And you anticipated something that we're going to have to address. There are no CDC guidelines yet about what you do when you get a group of people, all of which have been doubly vaccinated, because you're asking a very logical question. By existing guidelines, you still need to wear a mask, you still have to social distancing. But I believe that's going to change. I do, because people are asking, like you, a very obvious question. What's the reason to get vaccinated in the first place if you don't want to get to normal? So I believe, and we're talking about this at the level of the CDC, about what kind of new guidelines you can give to people who are gotten a vaccine that's 94 to 95% effective. What about not only with your friends, doing things socially that you enjoy so much, but something like my own situation where I'm doubly vaccinated. My daughter is doubly vaccinated. The last time she tried to come home, she had to go quarantine for 14 days and get tested. It was a big, big deal to finally see my daughter in the same room. I think that's going to have to change, but no official guidelines. Hang on, I'll say I spoke to you and I'll make that my impetus to get things rolling.
Well, I don't go to visit Jonathan and the family. I haven't seen his wife. I haven't seen Shannon since all this time, nor the kids. And though we'll both be vaccinated, I still can't go there, right? So here I am.
All right, I'm going to ask you to leave. Thank you.
I'm leaving. He says I can't, but I love you.
Here.
I
love you
happy
too.
belated birthday.
Nice to meet you.
Catching up with me.
All right. Thank you, Tony, for enduring. And that's with the CDC mahjong question.
Yeah, well, that was a question.
So I know you well enough to know that you tire of talking about the politics here.
Yeah.
And so I want to get that out of the way and then dive into the science. And I want to mention the politics because everyone is curious about it. When we spoke in March of last year, you were extremely candid with me. And it led to a lot of news coverage about the interview I did with you. I'm wondering whether you got in trouble for that interview. It was one of several candid interviews you did at the time, but I'm wondering, did you get any grief because of that interview?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I did. I survived the grief, but certain people in the White House felt I was being a little bit too candid, but that's my nature. I was candid, and that was it. But nothing that was prohibitive. I didn't get kicked out. I didn't get thrown off the coronavirus task force. But I did get a bit of flack for our science interview. Yeah.
Yeah, my wife said to me, how are you going to feel if Tony gets fired because of you? And then the world's a more dangerous place because of you. So I had a moment of wondering
It was a close call, but we made it. We made it.
So I'm curious, in all the political discussions that I've heard you have with journalists and others, I haven't heard you address one question. And where do you think you had an impact with the president, with Donald Trump, where you changed his mind about something and made him see things scientifically? Where was that? What are you most proud of?
You know, it's very difficult to say. I believe the fact that I was able to do the very difficult situation of publicly, sometimes right in front of everyone at the White House press briefing room, where you'd have to get up and contradict a statement that you knew was scientifically not accurate. I think if I had not done that, there would have been a feeling of more free floating capability of doing that, of saying things that were purely anecdotal. I think the fact that I was there saying, no, that's anecdote, that's not science.
Yeah.
But I think that essentially dampened a bit the complete unleashing of pure anecdote, which would have really been a disaster.
You were the adult at the teenage party, preventing it from going really wild.
Well, anyway, that's
That's
behind
my
us.
phrasing. So let's talk some science. I think a lot of people are concerned about the mutants for good reason. But at the same time, your talk made an important point. All of these vaccines that have completed efficacy trials with some data, all 8 of them, seem to have some evidence that they work well against severe disease and maybe 100% protection against hospitalization and death. I wonder, is your thinking changing, or do you think our thinking needs to change about our expectations? And did the 95% against mild disease somehow pollute our thinking of what our expectations should be?
Yeah. I mean, obviously you want to get as high an efficacy against any form of disease, but I think we need to accept the fact that one of the major purposes of a vaccine was really to keep people out of the hospitals and keep them from dying. I mean, if you have a vaccine that may not be 95% effective in preventing you from getting a sore throat and a bit of an ache for a day or two, but it prevents you from getting into the hospital, that's a big deal, John. So I think that we need to, I guess you can call it, manage expectations, that we may not get vaccines that are going to completely protect you against the mildest of mildest symptoms, but absolutely will protect you from going into the hospital. Then that's going to be a big victory.
I wonder whether this conversation about herd immunity is something of a distraction, because for more and more people I speak to, it doesn't seem to really be the point of what we're trying to achieve right now. We're really trying to get our hospital systems secured so that they're not overwhelmed and that people aren't getting very sick. What do you think? I mean, is the herd immunity discussion somehow need to be reframed?
Well, it depends on what you're asking herd immunity to do. I mean, if herd immunity is going to keep the level of infection in the community at such a low level that it doesn't essentially disrupt your life, that's the critical issue of what it is. To me, herd immunity is to keep the level of circulating infection, the number of cases per day, down to a level where it doesn't dominate your thought. I mean, you know, when you get herd immunity against measles, you know, that's good, because if the community is protected against measles, when it's reinserted into the community, you don't have a disruption of the entire community. You only have a disruption of the people who are under vaccinated.
Yeah, but that comes to flu, right? Do we have herd immunity against flu? I mean, we live with it, but we don't refer to it as herd immunity.
No, there isn't, because it changes so often. That's the point with flu. It's almost it's a moving target, herd immunity with influenza, for sure.
But that's what I'm getting at. It seems to me we're moving toward this notion that we need to think of this the way we think of flu, something we can live with and tolerate and has some serious consequences for some people, but we try to minimize that and not dream of it just going poof.
Right, exactly. I mean, if we can get a vaccine that protects against serious disease, and one thing that I really would like to see, and we're putting considerable effort in, is direct antivirals that you can give to someone who is compromised and elderly, somebody who you know has the possibility of advancing to severe disease. If you can knock the virus out in the first few days, someone comes in with COVID-19 symptomatic, give them 10-day course. I jokingly say almost like a Z-Pack for COVID-19, take 5 days worth of a direct antiviral, that could really prevent people from going into the hospital. So the combination of a vaccine that prevents severe disease and a direct antiviral agent is going to completely transform how we think of COVID-19. COVID-19, in many respects, is terrorizing a certain segment of our population. I mean, a lot of people don't take it seriously, particularly younger people who feel they're invulnerable. But it's killed 450,000 people already, John.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, right here in this country.
Yeah, more globally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about, this is a deep dish scientific question, but I know you can frame things for a larger audience. There's some question about mutational space. And so we've seen these mutations now that make the virus more transmissible. We've seen mutations that get around antibody responses to the spike protein. Do you think there's a limit to the amount this virus can dodge the immune response, and that maybe it's starting to show us its limits? Is that possible?
Well, absolutely. And what happens is that you can start mutating yourself into unfitness. So, yeah, exactly. You can mutate yourself into unfitness. And that's really one of the reasons why you wind up, when you have combination therapies, that you can mutate around one, not the other, and then all of a sudden you've mutated yourself into non-existence. I think even if left to its own devices, if you mutate enough, I think fitness will be one of the first ones that suffer.
Yeah. So I just wonder whether we may be seeing some borders of what it can do, rather than this being, oh no, the sky is falling. Of course, when the virus mutates, but maybe it's showing us some limitations of its mutation.
Yeah, possible. That remains to be seen. To be seen.
Well, you brought up the treatments, and I think one of the most confusing things for people who don't do your job is trying to understand why we've had so much progress with vaccines and relatively little progress with treatments. We have some monoclonals that do something. We have dexamethasone that does something. We have remdesivir that does something, but nothing is the treatment you're dreaming of. And some of the vaccines do look close to what we want. So why is this so much more difficult?
Well, the reason I think it's that, to me, the real therapeutic approach would be a direct antiviral. And if you don't have something on the shelf that you're lucky enough has activity against coronavirus, which thus far we've not been particularly successful in direct antivirals, then in order to make a targeted antiviral, it's measured in years to be able to do that. So I think it was the idea that we needed something really right away. So we started going for things that are easy. It's easy to make a monoclonal. Dexamethasone we've used forever. Convalescent plasma is, self-explanatory. But the real thing that I'm looking at, John, is a couple of companies have direct antivirals, and I think we're going to be able to use a combination of direct antivirals. That's going to be the answer. It wasn't for lack of trying. I know people say, well, you put so much into it. Right. Vaccines for coronavirus, we're fortunate enough to have the combination of some vaccine platforms that everyone, including John Cohen, had some concern about. Like, why are you investing so much of your effort into the mRNA?
Oh, well, that wasn't exactly my concern. My concern was that there seemed to be a hand-waving dismissal of inactivated vaccines and attenuated vaccines. Like, it had to be a fancy new technology.
No, your point is well taken. But ultimately, they're all in play now, which is good. But
Tony, I want to stop you there for a moment, because I don't believe that's true. I don't think the United States has seriously considered data from China or encouraged Chinese companies to bring data to the FDA to look at vaccines that have been widely tested in efficacy trials. And we're just completely dismissive of that those could help us.
What are you referring to? What
I'm referring to Sinovac and Sinopharm. I don't see Operation Warp Speed saying to the Chinese companies, hey, bring us your data. The FDA would like to evaluate it. It might be helpful in the United States. I think we're completely dismissive of it.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, we're doing pretty well
We
with what
agreed
we
it wouldn't
got.
be any fun, you know? So I want to clarify something for people who might not understand the lingo. A direct-acting antiviral actually targets the virus itself and viral enzymes. It's not just throwing something off the shelf at a virus
No.
that has broad activity. It's saying, hey, the virus has this enzyme. Let's cripple that enzyme. That's what you're getting. Right?
Exactly what we did with HIV. You know, we started off with reverse transcriptase inhibitors, then we went to protease inhibitors, then we went to integrase inhibitors. So it was really, you know, taking the replication cycle of the virus and identifying vulnerable targets for direct intervention. And it led to one of the most spectacular success stories in antiviral therapeutics. I think we need to do some, you know, I wouldn't say some, I think a lot more of that approach, because I think that right now, if we really want to be protected against the progression of disease for any kind of a new coronavirus, you're going to want a direct antiviral. So to me, that's the big failing.
Well, do we need a massive investment like Warp Speed did in, you know, $11 billion to get that industry going? Do we need that for direct antivirals?
Yeah, we need, and I'm not even going to tell you, I already know the price tag, but I'm not going to announce it to you, John.
You can tell me. I won't tell anyone.
No, right.
So one of the things that I think people are also curious about is what have we learned from this? What are we going to do better next time around? We had all these pandemic preparedness plans. You went through all these exercises. You wrote all these documents, and still we got walloped. What are we going to take away from this that's going to help us the next time around?
Well, I think, John, even at its very best, without having the extraordinary circumstances under which this evolved in our country, this is such an extraordinary virus. I think one of the things we can learn is don't ever underestimate what an emerging virus can do that you've never seen before. I mean, you know, a virus that all of a sudden is asymptomatic in 40% of the people. As I said in the talk that I just finished, the baffling situation that over 50% of all transmissions come from an asymptomatic person. That was unheard of before. We got completely fooled by that. So the nature of the virus was, boy, you know, we really underestimated its complexity and what it could do. And the other thing I think is that we had a very interesting situation, apropos of what you were saying before, that we were fighting a very serious pandemic in the midst of an extremely divisive society. You know, to be able to not have a consistent message of non-pharmacologic prevention was very frustrating. You know, to be able to say, we want to have a gateway, a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, and then in the middle of it have states do whatever they want to do. I mean, completely against an organized public health measure. So I would think that one of the things we've learned is A, don't ever underestimate the capability of a virus, and B, if you're going to fight a public health challenge, do it when society is in unison and all agreed upon what you need to do.
Yeah, as Moncef Slaoui says, you know, next time pandemic virus, please don't show up during an election year.
Right.
Yeah. But I wonder, because that's a point that I raised with you in March in that interview that might have got you into a little trouble. There wasn't really, from the White House, a sense of federally organizing things aggressively. It was more, well, the states really have got to do this. We'll back them up. And then the Biden administration comes in, and I don't mean to editorialize. I'm curious what you think, but my sense of it is they have a very different philosophy about the role of the federal government.
Well,
How do you
absolutely.
see that shift?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because right from the very beginning, in the early part, as a task force member, always felt that there should be a very close cooperation, collaboration, and hopefully synergy between the federal government and the states and the cities. You don't want the federal government to do everything for the states, but you can't leave the states on their own and say, you're on your own, it's your baby. And that's exactly what happened. We overdetermined the federalist approach, that the states are independent, they could do what they want to do. Because, when you have a brand new emerging pandemic infectious disease, it doesn't know the difference between Mississippi and Alabama or New Orleans and Texas. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't really care. And yet we were acting like each individual state had their own separate virus and they could do things very differently. And I was concerned about that right from the beginning. I mean, last March, April, May, June was the idea of that, put the states on their own, let them do what they want to do. And right now, what we're doing is we're not dictating to the states what to do, but we're making it very clear that we have a very, very strong partnership with the states, not only in providing resources, but in helping them with a plan. Like, here is the strategic plan of what we want to do. Make no mistake about it. It's right here. Click on whitehouse.gov. It's 100 and some odd pages, but it's a plan about what you want to do. So instead of going in multiple different directions, you're pulling together.
Yeah, 15 days to slow the spread, I remember, was like a 2-page sheet.
Right.
I'm curious too about the impact that the politics had on the institutions of science, on the NIH and the FDA and the CDC. And I don't believe you were supportive of the convalescent plasma EUA. Should that be revoked now? I know it's been backpedaled some, but should it be revoked? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't want to opine on that. I think that the people who are going to be involved in that will make that decision.
Let me reframe that. How do the FDA and the NIH and the CDC rebuild their stature to separate themselves from politics? Because the FDA certainly pushed through hydroxychloroquine against the scientific community's widespread advice not to do that. The CDC rewrote documents that they didn't want to rewrite. The NIH rescinded a grant that was peer reviewed and given a very high rating because of pressure from the White House. All of the institutions, I think, and Holden Thorpe has written about this a lot, took a hit from it. Do you see there needs to be a rebuilding of scientific credibility and independence?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the NIH was hurt badly at all. We were pretty successful in maintaining our independence. I think some of the other agencies, unfortunately, were in a different position than us, and it was much more difficult for them to do that. And I guess it's the idea of getting political people into agencies and having them have an influence. But I believe that right now that you're going to see a reestablishment of the credibility of the CDC and of the FDA to the extent that any of it was lost in the last administration.
I want to look forward and ask you something that's really tricky, and that's how do we make pan-coronavirus vaccines, pan-influenza vaccines? How do we do genomic surveillance at a level that's fast and broad scale? How do we get to that next place with science driving, being the engine driving all that?
Well, I think that there's a big difference between success or not in developing a universal coronavirus vaccine. And by the way, I would start off with a universal SARS-CoV-2 before I worried about a universal coronavirus. I think that that's going to be much more problematic than really the technical doable thing of just getting much, much more widespread genomic surveillance, which the CDC and the NIH is working on together to really be able to enhance that much more than it is right now. So that I think is relatively easy to do. Just got to put the resources in to do it. We got a lot of people that know how to do sequencing. You need to link them, get them into a common database, and you're there. The science behind how you're going to get truly a universal SARS-CoV-2, I think like any other scientific challenge, you got to work on. I'm not sure about how feasible it is. I think we could do it. I think we could.
So I don't mean to get in your face about it. You are 80 years old. My mom's 91. You're both very sharp. I'm not. Don't misunderstand me. What do you want to accomplish now? I mean, you're going to retire at some point, I imagine. But what between now and that point when you're 103 and you retire? What are your goals as a young man? What do you want to do? A young man with a dream. What is it that you want to do now?
Well, I think you got to put it into perspective of what we were doing before and this pandemic that has thrust itself upon us. The first thing I want to do is to get this pandemic behind us. I mean, completely behind us. Essentially, what we did with polio, what we did with measles, in the sense of not making it a threat anymore, because it's terrorized the planet for over a year. That's the first thing. Then getting back to what we've been trying to do for some time, ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic as we know it, not only in the United States, but globally. But let's start off with the United States. One of the important positive aspects of the things that was started in the last administration was the effort to end the AIDS pandemic in the United States, epidemic in the United States. I want to get back to that and see if we could do that. The other thing is the technology of vaccines, particularly mRNA, but that's not the only thing, is to relook at malaria and tuberculosis to see if we can get vaccines for that. So if you want me to retire, just say, wait a few years until we get a vaccine for malaria, for tuberculosis, and for HIV.
That's not a very big ask.
And then I'll go play bingo with your mother.
Mahjong.
So I can't play, right? I can't play.
We're going to wait to see what the CDC's Mahjong regulation is. Dr. Fauci, thank you so much. And I think a lot of people want to say thank you to you. And, I'm a journalist and I'm not allowed to have an opinion. So I don't have any opinions. But I do think that I can communicate to you that the scientific community really took a lot of heart. And in what you did, and after I did that interview with you that got you in a little bit of trouble, I got a flood of emails of people saying, thank you for allowing Dr. Fauci to speak his mind. Yeah. So a lot of people applaud the fact that you spoke your mind. And we are defined, I believe, by how we behave during a crisis. And I think in this crisis, you were somebody, the team was glad to have you playing the role you played. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you. Always a pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Nice
Bye-bye.
Love you.
Love you too.
Thank you so much, Tony and John. To say that was a fabulous conversation is such an understatement. For those of you who do science communication, for those of you who want to do science communication, I know there's a lot of you in this audience, what you just witnessed was a master class on both sides of the virtual screen. The questions were powerful. The communication from Tony Fauci was spot on for this audience. So I just want to say, if your goal is science communication, you just witnessed a master class in how it's performed. And it is true that we do learn about ourselves in crisis, and thank goodness that the scientific community has been able to rally around not just Tony Fauci, but the folks who came together to put together the RNA vaccine, the folks who came together to put together all the other vaccines that are in trials. This has really been a community-wide effort, as Holden Thorpe often writes about. Well, with that, we've just about hit the end of day one. We hope you've enjoyed your time here today, and we're looking forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. And with any luck, Esther is going to be willing to take a job at science because she is every bit the journalist that John Cohen is. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening from Washington here. Join Jessica and Olga and me here tomorrow for another fabulous day with the AAAS Annual Meeting. Thank you.